This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. Today we're going to have a couple of episodes at least on the idea of a daimon within Greek mythology in particular. And the one we are going to talk about today is called Lethe. Now, Lethe is understood to be a river in the Underworld. There are 4 rivers in the Underworld, and Lethe is the river associated with forgetfulness. Now, in addition to that, she is sometimes referred to as a goddess and sometimes referred to as a daimon. Some refer to her as a personification of the river. But if you actually read the literature, it's very rare that Lethe is actually personified. Lethe is not addressed as a being that speaks, for example. You see references to being on the banks of the Lethe, or more poetical things to Lethe's waters did not touch you, or something like that. But Lethe never speaks in a kind of first person way in any of the references to her in either Greek or Roman mythology. Now, there is also Lethe also tends to be a term used in connection with Memsene, which is the Titan associated with memory, actually the muse associated with memory, which is often invoked. Certainly Hesiod invokes Memsene among other muses, but he's certainly not the only one. It's very traditional for bards to invoke the muses before beginning, because they are trying to recite something that supposedly has happened from memory. And maybe literally from memory, because these are, epic poems and so forth that are memorized by the bards for repetition and for singing. So Lethe is considered to be often compared with Memsene, because Memsene, memory and forgetfulness. And Heidegger actually has some things to say about that within the idea of inconspicuousness or concealment, unscheinbar, in philosophy, which we'll talk about a little bit. But then I want to get into a view that sort of looks at the phenomenological view of both Husserl and Heidegger, and also about, but also a Jungian view as well, and the way that those, may come together. And in the way that Charles Scott, who writes about this in an essay called Pathways to Jung, talks about the way, Jung's theory about Memsene and Lethe is, as he said, hardly the best option, but they may be best understood in relationship to each other. And, we tend to think of Lethe as a negative, or at least that was conceived that way by the Orphics, this is something that, that potentially has a positive benefit as well. And this is another case of where there's a fine line. I'm going to talk about this, and I don't want to over talk about this, but this is a case of where we can point to what we call the archetypal and perhaps the real in a real experiential sense, where the two of those things may come together. And I will continually repeat, I know there's a lot of, particularly people in the esoteric community, who hate the term archetype. They see it as reductive, but that is to not be, and that's because oftentimes an archetype is presented as a psychological projection from the unconscious, which it is, but it's not part of your personal consciousness. It is part of some kind of collective and numinous and autonomous state. So it's something that is both external and internal by definition. And it has its effect on everyone. Because as we remember, Jung is actually describing these things based on his not only his own psychological experiences and explorations, but what he sees in his patients, not only in their neuroses, psychoses, but also their dreams, trying to find a way to describe this. An archetype is a difficult term, and of course any term that you choose automatically sounds reductive. It implies that there isn't a reality to it, that it's somehow all in your head, but that wasn't really the implication at all. Because Jung said the force of the archetype is not something You can become aware of it, but you rarely have conscious control over it. Other than if you recognize, you don't necessarily get rid of the feelings and the impulses associated with an archetype. And sometimes you can't even control your response to it. So I feel like when I talk about these female chthonic kind of daimons that are mentioned in ancient stories, that there is that crossover there between what is psychological and what is real. Okay, what is truly experienced, and how much of an external reality does that have? Now, to be fair, people who actually practice ceremony, practice worship, and so forth, wouldn't necessarily worship a being like Lethe, for example. This would be, where I think it becomes more of an issue when we're talking about deities. But nonetheless, there are daimonic spirits. And yes, anybody who engage in those practices will tell you that they most definitely have a reality. But to say that they're therefore not archetypal, I think it's incorrect. I think yes, there is a real reality. Nobody's denying that, but I think there's also an archetypal reality when you're trying to describe and discuss it from the point of view of that very complicated subject of human psychology, which is not merely a collection of your thoughts. Okay. So there's my little soapbox about that, gotten that out of the way. So, okay, Lethe. Who is Lethe? Now, Hesiod mentions lethe as being a daughter of Eris, the goddess of strife. Some others seem to think that Oceanus may have been the father of Lethe, because Oceanus is the one who produces all the rivers of the world. However, Lethe, being a river of the underworld, probably Eris would make a bit more sense, because Eris, of course, means strife. Eris is a chaotic deity that throws everything, throws in the monkey wrench of the unexpected, and creates it creates this. Lethe ends up creating this whole. Eris ends up creating this, taking things, the nice orderly expectations and just throwing them to the winds. We know that the Trojan War starts because Eris throws an apple in, that says, to the fairest. And of course, 3 goddesses at once go to claim it and then call upon Paris, Prince of Troy, to decide who actually is going to get it. And of course, the only way he's going to do it is through bribery. So of course, and the results of that end up leading to the Trojan War. So it's, Eris. So the idea of Lethe as a daughter of Eris, because there may be this idea, you might think about it as the idea of forgetfulness as somehow creating a kind of chaos. Okay. And you could see how that would be if you don't remember something that's important. That could be a problem, and that could lead to certain unexpected results. But Lethe is a little bit of a complicated concept. Now, the name itself is usually translated as oblivion, okay? And I feel like that's a key too, because forgetfulness is not necessarily always oblivion. So let's start by looking at the stories associated with Lethe. We know that Lethe is, we've mentioned the origins, is either a daughter of Eris or a child of Oceanus. Both of those have been described in the ancient literature. So if we look at some of the things from classical literature, I'm looking at theoi.com. Certainly Lethe is mentioned in the Orphic hymns, where he says, Thanatos, which is death, and Lethe, with oblivious stream, mankind, thy hypnos, as genuine brothers justly deem. Okay, so it's understood that Lethe, is often paired with Hypnos, which is the god of sleep. Hypnos and Thanatos are brothers. Sleep and death are brothers. And of course, we know that sleep is a kind of forgetful state. I mean, it's where your consciousness goes away, or, a different kinds of consciousness can potentially replace it. Because, your body processes still go on and you still think about things. You're still not, you dream, for example. So there is a kind of consciousness that's going on, but what is going on in the conscious world outside of you is something that's not seen or forgotten. And the Orphics did have a view of Lethe. There's, tablets and so forth from I want to say that, roughly the third, fourth century, I'd say 4th through 2nd centuries BCE. There are tablets for that Orphic initiates from different mystery cults. They found them. They usually usually associated with Dionysus in particular, but perhaps also with the cults of Eleusis and Demeter, where the initiate is given instructions that when they go to Hades, there's a cypress tree and there's 2 springs initially that flow from the, one is the spring of Lethe and the other is the spring of Memsene or memory. And the one of memory is on the right and the one of forgetfulness is on the left. And so those who are initiates, because they, if they're going to be reincarnated or come back, it was more of an idea of what they call metempsychosis. There's this idea of them, of this return. Usually you drink from the river Lethe to forget your previous life and to forget everything about it. And it's said that when you drink from the river Lethe, that it doesn't quench your thirst, so you tend to drink more and more of it. It creates a kind of oblivion because now you literally don't remember anything. And so then when your soul is ready to be reborn, it doesn't remember anything about its past lives. But what the philosophers would suggest and what the Orphics would suggest is no, don't drink from the spring of Lethe, drink from the other one so that you might come back and you might remember, so that you don't make the same mistakes that you may have made in another lifetime. Okay. So so this is a conception that comes from the mystery cults of the idea of Lethe as being something you want to avoid. You want to avoid forgetfulness. Okay. So let's go back and look at some of these. It says the river, this is flowed through the plain of Lethe in Hades. This is from Theoi. Also known as the Aemilis Potamos, or the river of unmindfulness. The river flowed around the cave of Hypnos, where its murmuring induces drowsiness. The shades of the dead were required to drink to forget their earthly life. Okay. Poets often use Lethe as a metaphor for the underworld in general. Okay. So there's some mentions here of Lethe. I'm going to try to stick to the ones. There's a lot of little mentions here and there. I would rather stick to the more substantial ones. So in the Argonautica by Apollonius Rhodius, Aethylades, who was gifted with unfailing memory, has long since been lost in the inexorable waters of the Acheron. Yet even so, Lethe has not overwhelmed his soul. Okay, so the idea of somebody who has this memory not been overwhelmed by Lethe. He retains memory in the underworld, in other words. Near the Cimmerians, a cavern lies deep in the hollow of a mountainside, the home and sanctuary of lazy somnus or sleep. This is from Ovid's Metamorphosis, where Phoebus, meaning the sun god or Apollo, beams can never reach at morn or noon or eve, but cloudy vapors arise in doubtful twilight. There silence dwells, only the lazy stream of Lethe, neath the rock with whisper low, or pebbly shallows trickling lulls to sleep. Oh my God, that's a mouthful to say. Before the cavern's mouth, lush poppies grow and countless herbs, from whom bland essences a drowsy infusion dewy knocks or nicks or night, distills and sprinkles sleep across the darkening world. So the idea of, this is metaphorically about the idea of sleep coming from dew sprinkled by the night goddess, taken from the stream of Lethe. Now in Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, and this has to do with, has to do with his encounter with Sibyl. Now did Aeneas descry, deep in a valley retiring, a wood secluded copse whose branches sighed in the wind, really probably, and the Lethe river drifting past the tranquil places. Hereabouts were flitting a multitude of phantoms without number. Aeneas, moved by the sudden sight, asked in his ignorance what it might mean. What was that river over there, and all those crowds of people swarming along its banks? Then the ghost of his father Anchises said, They are all the souls who are destined for reincarnation, and now at Lethe's stream they are drinking the waters that quench man's troubles, the deep draught of oblivion. They come in crowds to the river Lethe, so that you see, with memory washed out, they may revisit the earth above. Okay. So this is where we see this mentioned in the Aeneid. So this is the scene when Aeneas actually goes to the underworld, and he goes to visit his father, who is in the Elysian fields, which is the better part of the underworld. It is the nicer, the part that I guess the part that is more the most like the above world. shall we say, in terms of, probably having light and beautiful fields and plenty and things like that. Virgil refers to poppies as being steeped in Lethe's slumber. So we think of poppies and their opiate qualities being there. And poppies, so poppies have an association with Lethe. Okay, so let me just see if there's anything else. Seneca in the Hercules Furens, which is a tragedy from about the 1st century of the Common Era. He says, within the abyss of the underworld, Lethe measureless in sweep, glides smoothly on with placid stream, and takes away our cares, and that there may be no power to retrace the path, with windings manifold, it takes its sluggish way, even as the vagrant meander, with its inconsistent waters, plays along, now retreats upon itself, now presses on, in doubt whether to seek the seashore or its source. Okay. So there's this description of the river. Because then there's a lot of references to Lethean depths, which is where they use Lethe is a, instead of using the term Hades, using Lethe instead. And Valerius Flaccus in the Argonautica there, the witch Medea summons Hypnos. The Colchian ceases not to foam with hellish poisons, and to sprinkle all the silences of Lethe's bow. Exerting her spells, she constrains his, meaning the serpent of the golden fleece's reluctant eyes, exhausting all her Stygian power of hand and tongue, until sleep gains the mastery over his blazing ire. So this is the way in which the Medea puts the dragon to sleep that guards the golden fleece, so that Jason may actually take the golden fleece. Okay. Okay, so there's some other discussions here about, according to Statius, I want to make sure I'm saying that right, Lethe is said to be the dull guard in the court of Hypnos in the underworld. In the hollow recesses of a deep and rocky cave are set the halls of lazy Somnus or Hypnos, and his untroubled dwelling. The threshold is guarded by shady Chias or Heschia, which is quiet, and dull Oblivio or Lethe, and torpid Ignavia Ergia, which is sloth, with ever-drowsy countenance, as well as with silence, where Silentia with folded wings sit mute in the forecourt. Okay, so we have this image. You can see where the idea of the underworld as a psychological thing can come from, because you have all of these attributes of human behavior in psychology as daimons in this place of the underworld. So you have, sleep is certainly a state that we have, but quiet, forgetfulness, sloth, which is, we associate sloth with laziness. There's a sense of, not lethargy or not moving, right? And then silence. So this is sort of that, representing these kind of states within the psyche. And this way, the underworld becomes a kind of metaphor for that kind of psyche in the way that it mentions it. Now, okay. Now, as far as where Lethe is located, there are 5 rivers in the Greek underworld, so I'll mention the other ones. Are Acheron, the river of sorrow, Cocytus, which is the river of lamentation. It's either Pyrophlegathon or Phlegathon, the river of fire, and Styx, which is the one that separates the earth and the underworld. And Lethe supposedly borders Elysium, the final resting place of the virtuous. Maybe virtuous is not the right word there. It's the final resting place of those who are favored by the gods. I think that's more accurate than necessarily the virtuous, because it's not a place, not necessarily a place for everybody. Although again, the Orphics did strive to get to that place, and the idea of it as virtuous may come from the philosophers. The resting place of the virtuous, because, as I've said before, the ancient underworld has no judgment. There's only those that are really hated by the gods, or who do really bad things against the gods, who end up in the depths of Tartarus, and everybody else, regardless of who they are, more or less has the same fate. Ovid wrote that the river flowed through the cave of Hypnos, god of sleeps, where its murmuring would induce drowsiness, as we just said. Okay. So the river Lethe was said to be located next to Hades' palace in the underworld under a cypress tree. And Cyprus, of course, associated with Aphrodite, and of course also with desire, therefore, in that sense. Orpheus, okay, supposedly in the Orphic tradition, he would give some shades, the Greek terms for ghosts or spirits, a password to tell Hades' servants, which would allow them to drink instead from the Nemseni, or pool of memory, which is located under a poplar tree. An Orphic inscription, said to be dated from between the 2nd and 3rd century BCE, warns readers to avoid the Lethe and seek Nemseni instead. Okay. And drinkers of the water would not be quenched, causing them to drink more than necessary. Okay, so we've said all that, not to be repetitive. So, okay, so we see this river, again, the mythologies of it, we've gone over more or less what they are, and as we see, Lethe is often used either by poets as a metaphor for the underworld, or just a metaphor, just a geographical descriptor within the underworld, or as, the function of Lethe as, relieving souls of their memory of their life. Which is somewhat interesting, too, because when we think about the way in which certain necromantic rituals work, because it's as though souls are relieved of their memory of the past, but they have an ability to see the future. But if we look at the Odyssey, for example, in the Nicaea, the book where Odysseus and Circe go to the underworld, and she performs the necromantic rites to bring up Tiresias. As you can see, there are many souls that are attracted by the blood, and they come up and they speak. And these souls all seem to have, well, they can see the future, but they also seem to have a memory of the past. So, for instance, Odysseus's mother would recognize him. Whereas in theory, if she had drank from the river of forgetfulness, maybe she wouldn't recognize her son. But the question is then, if you believe the reincarnation theory, which is actually a much later one, I don't know what people thought. Homer's not really clear about what happens to the psyche or the psyche, because the psyche and the eidolon are two separate things. What remains in the underworld is your shade, or which is basically like a smoky shadow, a very weak image of what you once were. Whereas the psyche supposedly is like a winged creature. As I've mentioned, even the term anima has its roots in words for birds. There's this idea of being able to fly. The soul always has this idea of flight or flying away. So in other words, the conscious part of you that made you a living being flies away. What's left of you in the underworld is your shadow. And presumably, it's not clear whether it's the eidolon or the psyche that takes from the river Lethe. Okay. Perhaps it's the psyche, because if it's a soul that's going to be potentially born again into something else, which again is not clear that that's part of Homeric thinking, that seems to be a later thinking that comes more from the East, whether it be from Persia and whether Persia got it from the Far East or not. I mean, that's a whole separate discussion. Certainly, a lot of things did come from Persia into Greece. Certainly, Orphic beliefs very likely came from there, and probably from Egypt as well. But so the question then becomes, if the eidolon still has a memory of its previous life, that's a little interesting, because it seems like, or is it just when they drink blood, which is the force of life, that they actually then regain that memory to some degree? So interesting, sort of logistical question there. But let's talk about some Nemseni in some of the other senses. Okay, so Martin Heidegger tends to use the term Lethe to refer to concealment, okay? And, as opposed to aletheia, which is alethe, which is unconcealment, basically. So it's like a revealing of the truth, shedding light on something, okay? But Heidegger uses this term, and I don't know, I don't know German, but the term used is unscheinbar. And I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly either. That is the term that he uses, which is, and it's the idea of something, because the word shine apparently is used to, I'm just reading from a article where they say it's often used to refer to a license, ticket, or warrant, which are characterized by being unquestionably trustworthy, okay? So, or authentic. So shine would have to do in this sense, the implication is that of seeing that which is as it really is. And unshine bar indicates that it's that which is, as he explains here, not that which is claimed to be obvious, but rather what one openly surmises or conjectures to be true. This is actually what I would call, this is when I use the term unconscious narrative. That's what I'm referring to. And this is how it's referred to here in phenomenological literature as, this idea of something that, how is it? I'm trying to think. There was a good phrasing for it here. Let me find it. It was just looking at what Heidegger says. There's a phrase, and I just read it, and I want to. What was it? See, okay, yeah. Heidegger uses Lethe not to symbolize not only the concealment of being or forgetting of being, but also the concealment of concealment. And that concealment of concealment, it's also, Alan Watts talks about it as well. I mean, not from a phenomenological viewpoint, but he talks about it as when you meditate and you watch your thoughts. Then there's the question of who's watching the watcher, But I think or in terms of the way in which we reason things or the way in which we interpret what we see, that idea would have more to do with, things that we take for granted, really. And that's what I always say. You always want to ask the question about this particular thing, because the truth, because it's like you concealed something from yourself in a way. It's in that you're always starting with a premise that you are assuming is unquestionably true, but the question is it unquestionably true, or is there a truth concealed behind that one? Okay. And oftentimes the things that we go through life assuming to be the case or to be true may not in fact be what we think they are at all. In fact, that's one of the reasons I started this podcast, because, again, there's certain assumptions that we have about good and evil, about darkness, and even about the feminine. There's things that you may consciously say, oh, no, I think this and this. But unconsciously, and through your behavior, you're indicating that you have an automatic assumption, whether you are aware of it or not, of something completely different. So the question is, did you notice this? Or by the way, did you know this? You assume this is this, but it really may not be that. So Heidegger would use the term Lethe in that sense, and to refer to this discussion of what's concealed behind that. But the question is, so there's an attempt to say, okay, so what does one do with that problem? Because Heidegger saw that as the problem of philosophy. He said, there's too much philosophizing based perhaps on what we think we know. But then the question is that really a mode of forgetfulness, or is it merely a mode of being concealed? Is what's concealed, because as we've noticed, Lethe has also been translated by philosophers as unmindfulness. So it implies a lack of awareness of something. But, so I'm turning to this article by Charles Scott called Nemseny and Lethe. And I'm just going to read a little bit from this. This is from a edited volume called Pathways into the Jungian World. And he says, Lethe, the region of forgetting and oblivion. In Plato's Republic, Lethe functions as an image of forgetfulness, one that Socrates recalls, but in that recall suggests that it hides itself, that it refuses not only eternal reality, but clear imagery. Okay, you notice they were very obsessed with clear imagery. And in its hiding, gives humans to believe that their limited perceptiveness can traverse everything that is the full range of being. Now that's an interesting idea, because that kind of fits in with modern ideas about, reality as a hologram, or the way in which someone like Donald Hoffman would talk about, reality isn't what you think it is. Like you're experiencing an interface of reality. You're not experiencing what's really behind it, because your perception's just not capable of it. It's limited. So that it almost connects in with that limitation of perception. He says Lethe's imagined as a river flowing with water that cannot be contained, water that disperses determinations and discriminations. Drinking its water, souls cease to remember their lineages and lives. They assume a flowing transience, lost to their own permanence, lost, strangely, to their own source. This loss is figured by desire. The flow of Lethe creates, as it were, a desert without springing life, because this water does not nourish or quench. It makes dry, gives no satisfaction, will not become a life-giving source to any organism. Those who drink Lethe starve as they long for water. Lethe, daughter of dissension or Eris, produces something in the direction of chaos by the way of continuous evacuation. So far, Lethe appears inimical to life, to give the soul to be a leaky sieve, as Karl Karenyi has said. The soul in this situation, as Plato writes of it, lives in a futile effort to replenish itself with immediacies that flow as they come to presence. They flow away as they come to presence, Its life is like an unremitting effort to be here now, continuously unsatisfied, thirsting for what Lethe gives in withdrawal. In this imagery, Lethe embodies the soul's self-forgetfulness, its withdrawal from itself as it lives out of itself. Okay, so in this case, there's almost a sense of deliberate forgetfulness, because it's the idea that Lethe represents, just as when you die and go to the Underworld, you are withdrawing from human life. So similarly, in a state of thinking about it as a psychological state, Lethe can also represent a withdrawal. Say, for example, the way one might drink or do drugs to put themselves into oblivion so that they can forget the pain that they're suffering, for instance. Or just something that someone has managed to reinterpret or rationalize in such a way that they don't have to face the reality of something. I find this happens a lot, just as just one example, but when somebody dies, and if that person was a terrible person in life, somehow when they die, it's like all of that is forgotten, and all of a sudden they're just this saintly being. And I call me a terrible person if you want, but if somebody was a terrible person in life, I don't make them into a good person in death just because they're dead. That's just me. I mean, if their effects on people's lives were harmful, then I'm just like, well, yeah, you were a prick in life, and you probably, and the fact that you're dead doesn't change that. So anyway, that's just my bit of I don't know, a kind of iconoclasm, I guess you could call it. But okay, but in any case, so let's just moving on with this. Now, Scott goes on to talk about Karl Karenyi. He has an hypothesis that he adopts. He says, in pre-classical life, the image of Lethe presented the normal temporal life of human beings. Lethe is not negative, not something suggesting a need for philosophical or Eleusinian cure. So in other words, philosophers, well, really, there's probably not a whole lot of difference necessarily between philosophers and those who followed, the mystery cult cure. It speaks rather of outflowing. The archaic image of Lethe is that of a spring, and Karenyi suggests that it is fashioned after the spring of Memsene, the spring of memory, that the spring's force originates and gives something for return as well as for loss. There appears to be an early and inner affiliation of Memsene and Lethe that precedes their separation and externalization. Not surprising, right? This suggestion brings Memsene and Lethe together before their religious and philosophical dispersion. But Lethe also remains imagistically apart from Memsene, a spring to the left of the cypress tree, as one figure has it, and a spring to be avoided by souls of the dead, where Memsene is on the right, and of course, as we read near a poplar tree, that provides water of life, recollection, and balm. Karenyi sees the early Lethe as belonging to the land of Memsene, Memsene who, with her daughters, is the predominant power that heals the losses figured in Lethe. Lethe who belongs, nonetheless, to Memsene's eventful region. So, in other words, the idea of forgetfulness as being embedded in memory. And we know that to be true, because neuroscience says you can remember, I forget what the number is. I want to say it's like maybe no more than 4 or 5 things at a time. So your memory is often selective. And of course, the longer the time frame is between an event and our thinking of it, there's going to be gaps. There's going to be places in there where we don't remember something perfectly. Okay. So in a way, the idea of recall after even, a certain number of months or years, it's not necessarily going to be, there could be a difference from your account 10 years from now as it was at the time the event happened. Okay. So going on here, he says, in this account, the benefit of Lethe, and hence the dominance of Memsene, is found in the loss of life's disaster. Rather than only constituting disaster and darkness, Lethe also presents their obliteration, something like the withdrawal and the withdrawal of life, and defines an aspect of the muse's power to give Memsene's comfort. It is only both the elements, giving illumination and letting disappear, Memsene and her counterpole, Lesmosene, okay, which is another name for Lethe, that make up the entire being of the goddess, whose name comes solely from the positive side of her field of power. Memsene in this figuration retains her titanic depths and incorporates darkness in her luminosity in a manner that both defines and makes possible their later separation. Okay, so this is interesting too, because in this way of thinking, Memsene, the muse of memory, contains Lethe within her. And that only later on is Lethe conceived as something separate. And interestingly, once the philosophers get involved, as something to be avoided. Okay. Now, again, I don't want to get into, because now there's morality attached to it. Okay. And that's my problem with, while it's good to, there's a place for thinking things out and reflecting deeply. But there's also a place of where that becomes, I think of the Seven of Swords card, it becomes a futile attempt. It's overanalyzed to a point that it actually almost becomes a self-sabotaging kind of thing. It doesn't have that, it's lost, you've lost the sense of what it is in your attempt to dissect it. When you rip the frog open and pull its organs out, on the scientific, in science lab in school, you have pieces of a frog now. You don't actually have the frog, or you do have the frog, but there tends to be, in disconnecting it, there tends to be an emphasis. We lose sight of the whole thing. Okay, so it's so this is the okay, so just to go on here, he says, the religious and philosophical transformation of Memsene into a distant counterforce to Lethe, he says, is not altogether a surprise insofar as her lethic dimension constitutes a withdrawal of clarity and makes room for the art of recovery as well for the disaster of dumbness and oblivion. The taming of titanic Memsene and forgetfulness of her lethic dimension is what her image allows us to expect. Her titanic image also allows us to expect that her image is intrinsically forgetful in its power, and to recall that Memsene also presents nothing that is an image. Recalls to us no image at all, no image that is lost to its imagery. From such a loss in the midst of determinate images flows incitement to recall, reform, and to present again. So, in other words, forgetfulness is sort of part of the remembering process. Okay, so, but again, because we tend to think of everything in these kinds of separations, and certainly with philosophers being interested in knowledge and the accumulation of knowledge, there's this sense that something like forgetfulness would be akin to a disaster, but it's part and parcel of the same process. So the fact that the two springs are near each other, and again, rather interesting that Lethe's on the left and Memsene's on the right, because we think about that as, I don't want to say right brain, left brain, but the ways in which the body functions, and that's which the left side is receptive, and the right side is more, more active, more analytical, more active. It's a curious way, it's interesting anyway. It's curious that we think about that in those terms, in the same way that we tend to think of what's on the left-hand side is the Latin word is sinistra, and the word sinister has come to have a meaning that is not favorable. We think of something as sinister as sketchy or suspicious or something to be avoided. Where we speak of righteousness and things like that, which again takes on a very moral and judgmental kind of inflection. So, in any case, that is, I think, the most that I have to say about Lethe. But I feel, there's been this, like, it's a tendency towards. I feel like this discussion of Lethe. Well, first of all, like I said, she's a personified force. From the underworld, clearly. though she's obviously, probably was in earlier times hasn't had a connection to Memsene, quite literally, that they were not conceived of as separate. Okay. So, and they are probably best thought of in relationship to each other. But also just this idea that Lethe, because it, as one that creates that oblivion and that forgetfulness, while there are times when we obviously judge that to be problematic, Lethe represents that ability really to let go. And that is something we are incredibly, incredibly bad at. I will tell you, I'll just speak personally. I'm terribly bad at it too. Even when I want to let go of things, somehow the mind just, or even the unconscious mind just doesn't want to let go of certain things. You say, oh yes, this is going to change. And somehow unconsciously you keep doing the same thing as if you've never let go of anything at all. And I think everybody experiences that to some degree in some fashion. And it's one of the reasons that I say it's very difficult to cognitively change the way you think, maybe over a very, very long period of time. But it's why I'm a little dubious of cognitive therapies. There's people who tell me they work great, and okay, I'm not saying they're wrong. Obviously, if they've experienced it, then they would know. But my feeling is that there's way too much of an emphasis on cognition, and way too much of an emphasis on acquiring things, acquiring knowledge. One of the problems I run into in teaching university, are people who are students who, because they're in a situation, okay, they've been raised this isn't speaking for United States. They're raised in a K through 12 system that is now so interested in numbers and quantifying everything and test scores, even more so than they were when I grew up. I mean, yeah, we did take standardized tests, but it's gotten to the point of ridiculousness that everything is now taught to tests, and nobody actually does things that require memory, that require learning, that require maybe rote repetition of certain things that are best learned that way, okay? And that there's no, and that there's this push right from the time that they're very, very young, even before they go to school, of having to be bright. I think about the things that they used to have about, playing Mozart for your kid in the womb. It's like the idea that your kid's going to come out of the womb fully cultured and really smart and, being able to do things from a really young age. And, this whole idea of play just kind of goes out the window because you just have to know. And by the time these kids get to the 6th grade, this is what at least I've heard from teachers, they're totally burned out by 6th grade. They don't care. They stare at their phones. They look at distractions on the internet. And when you try to teach them something that actually requires some kind of depth, they're just not interested. They've been told they have to go to university, and they're just checking a box. And they're not. You may find some who still have an interest in learning, but I would have to say, I feel very safe in saying that the majority do not. They don't really want to be there. They probably would do well to either, take some time off and go out and do something and then come back and go to school if they're interested, or just not to bother. But it's become a business now, and the whole business is about retention, and now students are customers that have to be retained. So, so the idea of actually learning and retaining anything, pretty much goes down the toilet, and most of them are coming in without really any writing or reading skills to begin with, or not very many. And a lot of them plagiarize and buy their way through too. I mean, I hate to say this, but unfortunately I see it, and and the teachers who actually are trying to, pull the students to know, you want to do this properly, you want to learn this correctly, you want to remember this correctly. They don't care. They would rather live in oblivion. They don't care, because they don't feel, if it's not relevant to my getting a job, it's not relevant. So anyway, that's a side thing, but it is one of those things that I think about when it comes to memory and it comes to retaining and reflecting on things in the whole process. The way in which, Lethe can become just a total oblivion from what's really going on, or just trying to understand the context of everything in the world around you. So, I don't know, but Lethe, and again, because Lethe is that, in a way, that is that concealment of concealment. Just people just aren't aren't aware and aren't trying to become aware of that. So I don't know. It's interesting. It leaves us in an interesting place in our culture, and it leaves us in an interesting place with respect to understanding what's real. Or in as much as we need to, because that's the other thing. How much do you need to know about the truth? But also just in the way we interact and the way we end up alienating ourselves, not only from others but from ourselves, and not ever really thinking about it, just kind of going along. So anyway, that sounds very pessimistic, doesn't it? But that's all I'm going to say about Lethe. As we can see, I'm not making a moral judgment on Lethe, because as we can see, Lethe can have a benefit and it can have a detriment. And as a chthonic underworld force, there's definitely a heavy psychological element to Lethe. I mean, we're also going to talk about mania as well in another podcast. And mania is another same thing. It's the idea of you have this personification of this force that is perceived almost as external, and maybe does have an externality, to some degree, but is also experienced internally. That's how it moves through our nervous system. That's how we process it. Thank you. I want to thank you once again for listening. Please check out Chthonia.net for all my work. I'm exploding with work. I have a lot of new things coming up, a lot of new things going on. So, I will keep, on the blog and also on Patreon, I will keep everybody abreast, and as much as I can on social media, about new things that are going on. On social media, I'm Chthonia Podcast, 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Instagram and Twitter. I tend to keep up with Instagram more than Twitter. Twitter, I, put up things, mainly when podcasts come out. Just because you can't do all social media outlets. You generally focus on one. And I do a fair amount on Facebook too, mainly because a lot of things just transfer right from IG to Facebook. So, so there's that. So you can check out what's going to be new there. If you want to support this podcast and the other work that I do, please check out patreon.com/Chthonia. Certainly, people get extra material every month. You get first crack at knowing when new podcast episodes come out. And as new projects and things come up, I would like to see more of a community there. There are people who are there and are contributing, but I would love to build more of a community. Right now, I'm using a lot more external forums for discussions about things, and I would love to see Patreon itself become a forum for discussing, these things surrounding the dark feminine and related issues. So, so please, if you're interested, definitely do that and reach out to me. Because if I have enough people who are interested, then certainly I will commit the time to having more discussions beyond the podcast. Thanks again for your support. Thank you very much to all of my patrons, and see you in the next episode.